Will Rachel Reeves survive as chancellor? Will Keir Starmer still be prime minister in 12 months' time? Will Nigel Farage see off the challenge of Stephen Yaxley Lennon? Will Kemi Badenoch revive the Tory Party's fortune? And will the mighty Plymouth Argyle knock Liverpool out of the FA Cup? Happy New Year. It's 2025. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Yay, it worked.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Happy New Year to you all. And it has been a very quiet 3 weeks since we last aired the Downtown Den Politics podcast. Of course, it hasn't. There has been much going on in the world of politics. In fact, it's felt as though it's been as chaotic as when Liz Truss was in charge of the country. I'm joined to discuss what's been happening and what will happen during the course of the next 12 months with my two erstwhile colleagues, the wonderful Joe Phillips, busy mate of Nigel Farage these days, and of course, Jim Hancock, the BBC's man on earth. So, listen, I want to just ask before we start, good Christmas, guys. Jim?
Well, a roller coaster Christmas for me, largely about the football world. The sacking of Wayne Rooney on New Year's Eve. I didn't get I'm absolutely beating myself up. I didn't have a ticket for Brentford. Because I thought we would just get smashed. Then we win there and then we draw Liverpool in the fourth round. It's just been unbelievable. But a very nice family Christmas as well, which is the most important thing. He lied.
It's good to see the priority for Jim was the football over the family. Bloody hell, James. Honestly. So, Joe, how was your Christmas? Apart from the fact that I know you spent an interesting day with Nigel Farage.
Will, we did a live outside broadcast in Kent the week before Christmas, which was extraordinary, in front of a live audience of about 500 people, complete with Nigel being towed in by a sleigh, towed by two reindeer. There were rescue dogs. There was a military band, there was Razor Ruddock, English wine tasting, and a lady who got a bunch of flowers because she does wonderful things in her local village. Not much politics, but quite an interesting experience.
That sounds wonderful. And here was me thinking I was having a good time in Lanzarote, where it was 22 degrees most days. And as people who are watching this on YouTube will see, I've got a marvellous suntan. But I do need a haircut, which I will try and sort out later this week. But it was a marvellous Christmas spent with the family. And of course, on the football front, James, we saw the back of Sean Dyche at Everton, and David Moyes is back. He's got red hair, but we don't care. More grey these days, I'm afraid. But
We've
Jim
all
and I
lost
will
our
be...
managers.
And Joe lost.
And West Ham have replaced their manager. Graham Potter, I think, is a good appointment for West Ham, Joe. And... Jim and I will be at Moyes' first game on Wednesday evening when Everton entertain Aston Villa. But enough of this frivolity, because whilst we've been all off enjoying ourselves, or at least Jim and I have, Joe's been suffering Nigel Farage and his mates, there's been a lot going on in the world of politics, not least the economic situation in the UK, which seems to be at best flatlining, at worst declining. And Rachel Reeves has been under some significant pressure over the past week or so. The chief to the Treasury, Darren Jones, would call for an urgent question to the Commons because of the market's increasing gilt yields, which in layman's terms mean that the interest that the UK is paying on its debt, which is significant, as you can imagine, post-COVID, post-Ukraine, and all else that has happened in geopolitical terms. So that's putting pressure on Rachel Reeves's budget. And on top of all that, the business community has not reacted well to the autumn budget. And confidence within the world of commerce is probably lower than it's been for some considerable time. So not a great start for 2025 for the Chancellor. And Joe, how much pressure do you think she's under?
A lot, not least of all because MPs will have been back home in their constituencies. We've had a very, very cold snap, so there'll be a lot of people worrying about the cost of heating. Businesses, as you say, Frank, have got no confidence, and there are impacts on business because of the rise in the minimum wage and the national insurance contribution, which, you could argue that many of them, like Sainsbury's, for instance, who've made huge profits, are actually now voluntarily going to give their full-time staff a 5% increase. But for many medium businesses, it's a big hit at a time of great uncertainty. And I think there is a general feeling that although that it was a bit of a wobble on the gilts and bonds markets, that if she hasn't got the confidence of business, and there are growing rumbles and dissatisfaction amongst backbenchers, does she have the confidence of the Prime Minister? Because at the moment, it doesn't seem as though she's got a plan. And if the best plan is to go to China and come back with maybe £600 million of investment, but to do a deal for the Chinese to make so much of our solar and wind power infrastructure, which many people, including a former head of MI6, have warned against, then it doesn't look very credible. I think she's on very thin ice at the moment.
I think she's suffering from almost week one of her chancellorship, isn't she? She's been on the back foot since that winter fuel allowance announcement, and has seemed to be a chancellor that has been keen to take the options and advice given to her by the Treasury. I listened to an excellent podcast, I would recommend it to anybody who's listening, with Ben Wallace, the former Defence Minister, on Leading, which is a podcast that Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart do. He said his concern about Rachel Reeves is that she is a Treasury woman, in that, some of the options that she's accepted, i.e. the winter fuel allowance, the farmers' inheritance tax increase, the decision to only do one budget a year rather than two. Apparently, these are all options that the Treasury offer to every chancellor as they walk through the door of number 11. And every other chancellor has said no thanks to those options. So she's not got the politics of this right. I think she's suffering as a result of that. But I'm with you, Joe. I think gilt markets aside, you can sort of see that that's happening across the globe. Okay, we've been hit a little bit harder, but there's a story to tell as far as that's concerned. Where she will be concerned, Jim, is business and lack of business confidence. And as Joe rightly points out, that is what will be concerning number 10 as well.
Yeah, because the build up to the election was all about Labour courting business, and that was a really important part of the strategy. We're not sort of going to be frightening left wingers. We're going to support business, and so it came as a huge shock to business when that budget came out, and that's, I think, part of the problem. It's the sort of psychology of it. And you're right that the problem is she has taken Treasury direction, and it's meant that her room for manoeuvre now that the markets have gone against her is vanishingly small. Before the election, we had all the constraints she put on herself over VAT, income tax, and national insurance, with a qualification that none of us saw. But now, as you say, no second budget. I'm not coming back for any more tax, she told the CBI in November. She's constantly bringing herself with less and less room for manoeuvre. And I intend to begin this year with my old habits of remembering past events. Just on the China thing, all right, she hasn't brought back, a great deal. 600 million in the great scheme of things is nothing. But if she'd cancelled her visit to China, it would have been a bit like some of our older people watching us will remember Dennis Healey turning back from the airport in 1976 during the IMF crisis. If she cancelled that visit, the optics would have been really bad. The crisis isn't over. I mean, today early market returns show more pressure on the pound, and the problem for people with an historic view on this is that are we unbelievably so early in this government getting into that old story going back to Wilson in the 60s, Wilson and Callaghan in the 70s, of the markets lacking confidence in the Labour government and causing all sorts of problems. It's a very difficult situation, as Joe says.
More recently, Jim, Kwasi Kwarteng was flown back from an international gathering to be sacked by Liz Truss. So people will absolutely remember that. And of course, the economy was about to crash, although I'm not sure that legally we're safe to say that, because apparently we've got a letter of cease and desist from
a lettuce. Did you say?
Suggesting that Liz Truss was anything other than fantastic at managing the economy. I think the case for Rachel Reeves, if I may for a second, is that she did inherit an absolute shit show. I think probably the biggest mess that any chancellor has inherited since the war, actually. She also was or is a victim of the election of Donald Trump, and that's what's fripped the markets right across the globe. And if she can get through the next couple of weeks, I suggest a couple of things may happen. Firstly, Donald Trump, following his inauguration, we'll talk a lot more about the president-elect next week, will tell everybody that these tariffs that he's been threatening and all this other nonsense he's been talking over the past 6 weeks or so ain't going to happen, because he is as conscious as anyone of markets, and he will want to see a spike in Wall Street, and he will want to claim credit for that. So as soon as Trump starts to calm the waters economically, I think that things will start to settle a little within the markets. And then on a national level in the UK, notable to me, and unfortunately it's been lost in the ether of all the noise of this and other things that we will come on to. Last week, Keir Starmer made key announcements around the NHS. And if you look at the detail of that, some great stuff in there. Wes Streeting doing a fantastic job in terms of turning the NHS round. And I think you will see, as a result of that, decrease in waiting lists through the year. And this morning, Keir Starmer has announced, through private sector investment, the creation of over 13,000 jobs on the back of AI, which will be introduced to modernise public services. If she can get through the next few weeks, and then if she can get through to March, and the OBR actually say that growth is at least going to be as strong as they'd said back in the autumn, or indeed stronger because of some of the changes that happen because of the states and some of these announcements that the government are making, she's got a chance. But the fact that we're even talking so early on in this government about the Chancellor's position being under threat is somewhat concerning. Before I close the conversation, if, and I still think it's a big if at the moment, Rachel Reeves did have to fall on her sword, who would be her replacement, Joe?
Well, I would think Darren Jones, who's at the moment is her Deputy Chief Secretary to the Treasury, would be the obvious person to step in. But of course, we may come on to this later, but it is quite possible that there might be a hunt on for a new Justice Secretary. I'm sorry, not Justice Secretary, the Tulip Sadiq, who is a minister in charge of fraud and embezzlement, who is under an awful lot of pressure. And it may be that there is a mini reshuffle. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Frank, and we've said this before. Rachel Reeves doesn't have the instinctive politics, and the deadly combination of her and Keir Starmer, who also doesn't seem to have the political instinct that other leaders have had, I think makes it a very dangerous combination. And of course, if she does have to do a budget in March, it will be seen as desperate measures. But all the talks of cuts and cuts and cuts, is a signal of austerity. And whilst you can say, yes, we're going to cut this, we're going to cut that, there is a point when you can't keep blaming 14 years of the Tories, because everything you do is a choice. She made a choice on winter fuel. She made a choice on inheritance tax for farmers. She's made a choice on national insurance and minimum wage, and many of those things are good in the long term. But what she's done is she's created a fairly wide base of people who are so fed up and, worse, disappointed. And that, I think, is the danger for Labour, that people who put their faith in them to do something better and fix things are not seeing anything fixed at the moment, and what they see is more misery.
I think I would draw on the football analogy, though. It's 6 months, not 3 years, and I'm not sure what we expected to change as quickly. I think a mistake has been what we've said previously. Actually, she's not laid the ground for some of these things, and Jim hit the nail on the head, I think, in terms of her boxing herself in and continuing to box herself in. So, you know, the fact that she's gone to that CBI conference and said there won't be any new tax rises, you cannot commit to those sort of things when global politics is as chaotic as it is. We don't know what Donald Trump is going to do over the next 4 years. I'm saying that he's not going to introduce tariffs, but if he decides to introduce tariffs, where does that leave Rachel Reeves, the UK and European economics generally? But Jim, let's come back to this question. Joe was suggesting Darren Jones as a possible replacement. I think he's too close to the story. I think that's the problem. I think he's a good performer. I like Darren, but I think he's part and parcel of this narrative. It's all awful. It's all very pessimistic. And actually, we've got to go through this pain. I think if the governments are going to make a change, they need to find a personality who comes in a little bit left field. I'm not suggesting left wing, but who's got sort of fresh look to them in terms of the Treasury.
Yeah, I would put forward Johnny Reynolds. I've spoken before on this podcast. I think he's an excellent performer. I think he's solid, dependable. I'm obviously, I'm not sure about his economic expertise, but the business department isn't that far from the Treasury and things like that. So if I had to name someone, I would say a word of caution about this. You know, we're liable to be doing this sort of football manager 6 months and you're out. The Prime Minister is not an economist. He's vested huge power in Rachel Reeves and more or less told her to get on with it. Removing her would be a seismic shock to the government. I mean, in retrospect, and it is hindsight, the Tories were so unpopular that Labour could have risked not promising to put up income tax. They could have put up income tax and avoided all this pain over winter fuel allowances and trying to eke out money, which, you know, huge amounts of money that they need, eking it out from different things, annoying farmers and so on. That would have been the way through. And just finally, you're absolutely right. Everything now depends on some early wins this year on the things that they've laid out, because we've got to be a bit patient. You know, some of these things are longer term and housing will take a long time, but it would be handy, for instance, if waiting lists can come down. I mean, this story where they're actually advertising in a North London hospital for nurses specifically to administer care to people in corridors. Corridor nurses are being advertised for. That almost suggests a sort of structural change that some hospitals, and I don't blame them, are thinking this is a permanent feature of our care service. So the government does need to have one or two quick wins this year, and hopefully Wes Streeting can deliver it. I mean, I've got another issue with Wes Streeting over social care, but you may want to come on to that later.
No, we won't, because we haven't got time, but it's something we may be. Jim thinks it's a 9-hour podcast today. It's 90 minutes, Jim, not 9 hours. I think the final point I'd make in terms of the economy and Rachel Reeves' future is that I still think it's all to play for. I think that there will be some significant shifts over the next few weeks. March is a crucial time. But again, why, oh, why did she box herself in and not give herself the option of another set piece budget? And it was again on the advice of Treasury officials. And to me, You know, they continually are being bit on the arse because of poor politics in those early weeks and months.
Well, because business wants certainty and got a bit
Jim,
fed up with two bites of the cherry every year.
You've got to have a political approach to these matters. You can't be taking Treasury officials up because Treasury officials can't be asked to prepare for 2 budgets a year. They say, Chancellor, just do one. You don't need to. It'll provide certainty. Well, I tell you, Jim, if it's that good a news for the business community, why is confidence from business as low as it is? And, you know, similarly, the winter fuel allowance. Yes, it was the right thing to do. I will still argue the fact that it was the right thing to do, but it needed to be transitioned, needed to be a longer term running. She needed to say, let's consult, let's talk about how we can make sure we protect the most vulnerable pensioners in the country. But isn't it a nonsense that Richard Branson gets a winter fuel allowance? Yeah. She didn't do any of that work. We've talked about this before. And as I say, she continually gets the politics wrong. But I want to move on to our Prime Minister and Keir Starmer, because, again, talk, even at this early stage, and I found this quite remarkable, I have to say, that there is talk within the corridors of power as to whether there may be a challenge against him. Now, he's just delivered Labour its biggest general election victory since 1997. He inherited, we talk about Rachel Reeves inheriting a shit show of an economy. Keir Starmer inherited an absolutely broken Labour Party, and he turned them into a credible force that was able to, as I say, comfortably win on the 4th of July, a significant majority. I'm struggling, scratching my head as to see why he should be under pressure. But then we come to last Monday, and as I mentioned, he's made this really significant announcement on the NHS in terms of investments and the reforms that are going to be made. And the whole of the press corps wants to talk about not waiting lists, not social care, not some of the things that Wes Streeting wants to introduce to ensure that we get a much healthier population in the UK, but something that Elon Musk had been putting out about grooming gangs. And it's this problem, and I'm not sure it's a Labour problem, a Keir Starmer problem. They're just buffeted, Joe, by nonsense, absolute nonsense. He was right, I think, to take on that tweet from Musk and say, no, we're not going to do any more inquiries. And actually, you know, this is right-wing trolling and we're having nothing to do with it. But how easy, difficult, challenging is it, somebody who's an expert in communications, to just be able to crack on with the job that you want to get on with?
Well, it's very difficult, and I don't think that I have ever seen a press, you know, collectively so hostile to a government, a new government. I mean, the Mail and the Telegraph particularly are just non-stop. The Telegraph is now a mouthpiece for Elon Musk, presumably because they're hoping that he'll buy it. The Mail is just absolute, utter rubbish. And, you know, as you completely correctly say, Frank, you know, important announcements get overshadowed by the tweets of a, you know, super rich person in another country who's got absolutely nothing to do with what happens here. So why are we talking about it, you could argue, and I've spent quite a lot of time talking about it on other broadcasts, you know, but you can't ignore it. I think it is very difficult, and I think the problem for Starmer, he did well, actually, in his response to it. There are several things I would say in his favour. He dealt with the summer riots really well, really quickly, really, you know, strongly. He has done an awful lot of travelling, which I know people criticise, but it has reset Britain's position as a player, maybe not a big player, but a player, a significant voice still on the world stage. There are moves and conversations at resetting our relationship with Europe, which has got to be the way forward, not least because of defence and security. So there's all of that stuff that he has been working on. But at the same time, he has made some fundamental blunders. One, I think, is probably giving Rachel Reeves too much headroom without saying, hang on a second, let's just go through this. The other one was the rather silly appointment of Louise Haigh, forced to resign as Transport Minister, over something that apparently Keir Starmer knew about. But, you know, it was naive to think it wasn't going to come out. And I think, you know, it goes back to this whole thing about communications. If you know that 95% of the press hate you, then what you need to do is to work against that so that they haven't got anything. So don't allow these silly mistakes and blunders. You know, Tulip Sadiq is a case in point. Either go or deal with it. But you can't let these things rumble on. And that's where Labour have got it wrong. They've let things rumble on, whether it's winter fuel or grooming gangs or whatever it is. The Musk thing, I think, you know, requires a slightly longer conversation, because it is a real challenge, not just in this country, but it is worse in this country because of lazy and under-resourced media. You know, the only people, I know you have a beef about the BBC, but I will defend the BBC, and I know Jim will. You know, the BBC are the only people who are actually going, actually, none of this is true, and here is why. But who bothers to read those? And I think, you know, this is going to be magnified even more by the fact that Facebook and Meta are now getting rid of it. I mean, it is the desperate, craven desperation of these people who want to be part of Trump's inner coterie, even at the expense of attacking the democratic decisions of other countries. And I think that's really, really shocking. And I don't know how Keir Starmer and Morgan McSweeney, and, you know, even if you've got Alistair Campbell and Peter Mandelson and Charlie Whelan back in office, you know, I'm not sure how you deal with this. It is a new warfare in communications, I think. But the government have got to be sharper, quicker. They really need to stop and look and hang on a minute, what's going to be the adverse reaction to this? They need to go through that. Not the focus groups. They need, you know, people like us to go, hang on a minute, that's going to play like this. What's your answer?
think what I would say in defence of the government in terms of this particular issue and Elon Musk is that the grooming gangs issue is being addressed by the government. It was actually in their manifesto that Labour was going to introduce some of the recommendations that have been made in this very extensive 7-year inquiry, which cost us over £200 million. Not one of those recommendations has been introduced since its publication by the previous government. So the hypocrisy of the Tories, I think, was astonishing. And as bad as the media coverage of that story was, particularly from the right-wing press, and this is Musk demanded a national inquiry and saying that Jess Phillips, who one of the greatest champions of women's rights and has done more to protect women than probably any MP in the House of Commons at this moment in time, called her a genocide rapist or some nonsense like that. The media were bad in terms of its coverage, but I thought it was an appalling response from Robert Jenrick in particular, and the Tory Party generally. We come on to that in our second part of this podcast. But Jim, let's stick with Keir Starmer. The grooming gang scandal, he's had that to contend with. Obviously, he's got these wobbles with the economy, but made an announcement this morning about these new 13,000 plus jobs that are going to be delivered, which will do two things. One, I think it demonstrates that this partnership with the private sector and the investment is genuine and real. And secondly, it starts to modernise the public sector, which is crucially important if this country is going to survive. I'd say that whoever the government were, because we cannot continually simply pay more and more and more cash to public services and public sector organisations. But where do you stand in terms of Keir Starmer's position? Is he really under pressure?
I don't think under immediate pressure for a number of reasons. I mean, let's remember that after the Tory turmoil, we were all craving stability, perhaps at the expense of charismatic behaviour. So we've got a guy who's stable and dull in office now, and compared with the psychodrama of the last few years, we should perhaps be more grateful for that than some of the people who are calling for his head should have imagined. There's also the historical fact that Labour is far more reluctant to remove failed leaders or leaders who lose elections or fall out of favour than the Conservatives are, who get rid of their leaders very, very quickly. I mean, obviously, the historic examples are Harold Wilson survived the 1970 defeat, Neil Kinnock survived the 1987 defeat. So history's on his side. The party, actually, when it comes to it, is reluctant to do that. But as you said, his survival will depend a bit on the record, starting to get achievements, tangible results that show that his premiership is actually working. I mean, one begins to think, if one is going to entertain this speculation, and I think it's a bit premature, that perhaps, in 2 or 3 years' time, he will say, because he wasn't born into politics and all that, I achieved this great election victory. We're approaching the next general election. It's time for me to give way. You might start to see that narrative coming along, but I think that's a longer term thing than any question of him falling on his sword in the next few months.
Let me just stick with this grooming gangs situation, because it's something that I've been conscious of for many, many years now. And for people who are interested in hearing the sort of views of someone who was involved in this firsthand, we did a podcast with Simon Danchuk 3-4 years ago, maybe. It's in the Downtown Den Politic, not the Politic, the Downtown Den podcast series, and we'll put that in the link, Joe, if we can, the introduction notes, because Simon was absolutely distraught at the lack of seriousness with which complaints that he was making as the Member of Parliament for Rochdale at the time, taken by not just the police in Greater Manchester, but actually, Simon will say to you, he was getting told very quietly but very forcibly, look, drop this, mate. This ain't really where we want to go. It's an absolute scandal. And the fact that we exercise with what Elon Musk is saying, I think, is a nonsense. But nevertheless, it is time that this issue was gotten a grip of. And I can only say that credit to Yvette Cooper, actually, for bringing forward some significant legislation which will start to address this issue of people not being prepared to call out what is sickening, actually, behaviour. I mean, if you read some of the cases about some of these poor victims, it really is disgraceful. And undoubtedly, Joe, there was some issues within some communities where they were saying, well, we can't call this out because we don't want to have racial tensions. We can't have a country where we allow the police to step back from these issues because they think social cohesion is more important than these poor girls who are being raped.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely disgusting. But of course, it has now become much worse thanks to the intervention of Elon Musk, the absolutely disgusting behaviour and comments by Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch. And, there is a point where you say, OK, Alexis Jay's report, which took many years and cost many millions. Don't forget that was the second one. She did one in 2014, and then she did the other one, the bigger one, ICSA, and none of those things have been enacted. And actually, you do have to say, right, if the government and Yvette Cooper, who was Shadow Home Secretary through all of that time, really cared about it, they could have put it in the manifesto. It could have been an announcement.
They did, Joe. No, they did. They did, yes, put it in the manifesto.
But they didn't.
And again, in fairness to Yvette Cooper, and sorry to interject here, but it's something I'm really pissed off about, actually. Yvette Cooper has raised this issue multiple times in the Commons as Shadow Home Secretary, and indeed Joe Phillips has as well.
Jess Phillips.
Joe Phillips would have if she was in the Commons.
Yeah, no, well,
she should be.
Well, yes, and I completely agree, with what everybody has said about Jess Phillips. She has done more at huge personal cost to raise the issue. And, when she reads out every year that she does the list of names of the women who've been killed by men, usually in domestic abuse circumstances, but not always, you look into that empty chamber and you see there are not very many men there. I don't think I've seen Robert
Never
Jenrick
seen
there.
Jenrick there.
No, exactly. And you just sort of think that tells you pretty much what you need to know. I mean, I think what is so appalling, and there are so many appalling things about the grooming gang scandal, is that the girls, the victims, were not believed. They weren't believed by the police. They weren't believed by the people who were supposed to be looking after them, the social workers. They weren't believed by the local authorities. And there is a huge question to be asked about, you know, this attitude. They were worthless. I mean, why did the police allow a girl to go home with two men from a police station, who both of whom then raped her? You know, it just beggars belief. I do think there is some sense in what Andy Burnham has said, that yes, if you want to do another laser focused, time limited inquiry, that's fine. But you need to be really clear what it is you're trying to find out, because, you know, there is no point in having another 7 years. How many inquiries have we had? Macpherson, you know, the Windrush inquiry. We've had umpteen inquiries. Louise Casey's done most of them. You know, we've had Hillsborough. We've had many, and very few things have ever been enacted. So you can have a twin approach to this. You bring in all the recommendations that Alexis J came up with. The bill that went through on the second reading last week, that Kemi Badenoch and her lot tried to stop, which will put huge strictures on.
We'll come back to that, Joe. We'll come back to that when we're talking about.
You know, you can do that, and you can say, all right, what we need to do is to look at the records, because a lot of the problem of this is that there was no data and there was insufficient record keeping. So if you can determine, you know, and maybe Andy Burnham's the person to do that, working with Yvette Cooper, you know, you say, all right, this is what we want, but we've got a year. We don't want another 7 years.
But I think that you've got to be careful, haven't you? Because as soon as you start another inquiry, whether it's supposedly laser focused, and you know what happens, Joe, all these inquiries start to be as laser focused. They all start with a real big interest from the public. What's happened to the full COVID inquiry?
Yeah,
I mean, as I predicted, you know, it's going to cost hundreds of millions of pounds. And nobody's even bothered mentioning it these days. You know, there was a few titillating WhatsApp messages, but nobody's got to the nub of the problem. What if a pandemic happens again in a year's time? So for me, inquiries, listen, Andy Burnham, I think politically has said the right thing for him. But if you look at the amount of cash that has been spent by Greater Manchester on inquiries on Oldham, on Rochdale, you know, I'm sorry, you know, a lot of time for Andy, but I'd be saying to Andy, well, why didn't they do the job? Why do you need a national inquiry into something that was happening in your patch? So for me, the problem with inquiries, whether they're laser focused or otherwise, is that it allows those powers that be to say, well, hang on, let's not start to introduce these changes that are so clearly needed, have been recommended. Let's wait for this next inquiry, and it starts out, it's only going to be 12 months, and then, oh well, we need to interview some more people, and we need to make sure that we get all the, and before you know it, right, where we are is a situation where there's another inquiry, the victims still don't have any answers or any solutions to the challenges that they were facing. And for me, I hope that the government stick to its guns and say, no, do you know what? We're not going to have any more inquiries. What we're going to do is we're going to introduce those 20 recommendations that were made after a 7-year, £200 million inquiry. And we're going to support the victims and take the politics out of it. And it really does piss me off when people start to use the victims of such horrendous crimes for political purposes. And I'm afraid that's happened right across the political spectrum. I've heard Labour MPs say, oh, we need an inquiry. You do not need an inquiry. You need to crack on and deliver the recommendations from a very intensive inquiry that was made on this issue over a 7-year period. Sorry, Jim, rant
No.
over. I'll let you have the final word on this.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, I just want to make two rather ruthless political points about this wider inquiry. One is that what the Conservatives want is for the people that told Simon Damchuk to keep quiet, they hope will be other Labour politicians, and they want to try and dig in to what was going on between the Labour Party and Simon Damchuk and people like that, saying, "Oh, keep quiet about this because these people vote Labour." Let's be honest about it. Nobody on any broadcast I've heard have actually said that, but that's what the Tories want. With Andy Burnham, I want to be a little bit more careful, but perhaps it's fair to say that Andy always likes to be just slightly different from the national leadership of the party, just so differentiating himself. And I think there might be an element in that, because, as you say, most things that needed to be inquired into have been inquired into. We on the wider front, we just need to be a little bit careful about this. Where is public opinion about this? Because Jack Straw, to his credit, a long time ago, gave some searing analysis of this from his Blackburn experience, saying that it was mainly Pakistani men that undertook these dreadful things. It's because they regarded white girls in difficult situations as white trash. They didn't want to abuse their own community. Now, all this stuff, even as I say it, I know that there are elements in this country that, will just want to pile on. And that's my anxiety. I'm pleased, actually, in a way, that we are identifying the majority, not all, there's white perpetrators as well, but this is a cultural thing. And we've got to be very careful that there isn't, at some point, a huge backlash, led to some extent by Jenrick's comments about medieval attitudes. But I would just finally say on that and there have been some, but I'd like to hear more from the moderate Muslim community about their attitudes to women. They are in a multicultural society in Britain. They're living in Britain, and women's rights are championed by the left. And I want to hear a bit more from the Muslim community saying how they accept the role of women in this country, that they're living in this country and they're very welcome to live in this country, but women have to be respected. And I'd like to hear a little bit more from that, so that Jenrick, coming out with this dreadful stuff, can't generate a support from people like Farage that want to just capitalise on this.
Right, James. Well, on that note, that's a nice segue into the next episode of the Downtown Den Politics podcast. Yes, I've learned the lesson. Keep them wanting more. So if you want to hear our thoughts on the other side of the political spectrum, what's been happening with the Conservative Party, what's been happening with Nigel Farage, apart from his Christmas dalliance with our co-host Joe Phillips, and indeed what's been happening with the Liberal Democrats too. So if you want to hear our thoughts on that and our predictions for 2025, then come back tomorrow, because we're going to do another episode of the Downtown Den Politics podcast. For one time only, it's a 2-episode week. So for now, goodbye, and we will speak to you again tomorrow. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.